In Essential Task 10.4, we are going to describe the sensory process of hearing. Hearing is the other major sense that the College Board typically emphasizes on the AP exam. As you'll see, and I'll preview the last essential task, all of our other senses like smell and touch and taste all have singular boxes attached to them. Vision and hearing just happen to be the two senses that the College Board emphasizes the most, so they will be the two that we devote entire concept maps to. I will return now to the task text, allow you to copy down the portion in yellow, or in this case, actually the portion in orange, before proceeding into the concept map. Starting all the way at the top, we have a singular box here on auditory transduction in relation to the auditory sense. This term transduction, the term attached here at the very end, is a reference to the process of taking one form of energy and transferring it into something that our brain can interpret. In the case of our sense of hearing, we're going to be talking about sound waves in the environment, from the sound waves produced by my voice to the sound waves produced by a phone touching the desk or music playing out of your phone or computer. Regardless of where the sound is being produced, the process of auditory transduction begins when sound waves enter the ear, and specifically the ear canal. It's unlikely that you would need to know the ear canal as a term on the AP exam, so I don't include it. But this green portion here is the ear canal. Those sound waves eventually hit what's called the eardrum. You've probably heard of the eardrum. And then it hits the middle ear. It actually should say ear right here. It says just middle. It should say middle ear, which is a reference to these blue regions here in the diagram. We'll talk about what that produces in just a little bit. But when the sound waves enter the ear canal, hit the eardrum, they produce tiny vibrations here in the middle ear, these little three blue structures here where the orange arrow is indicating. The vibrations here in this blue structure stimulate what almost looks like a giant purple snail in the middle of your ear. Particularly, it's actually called in the inner ear. It's called your cochlea. Your cochlea is lined with hair receptor cells. They are the equivalent of the rods and cones that we talked about in the previous essential task. But stimulations produced by the vibrations caused from sound waves entering the ear canal and hitting the eardrum, and then subsequently the middle ear regions identified here. Those vibrations produce stimulation on the cochlea, this region here that we're talking about that looks like a snail. The stimulations on the cochlea are especially important because they produce action potentials that are sent technically first to the thalamus, but then eventually to the temporal lobe. As we talked about in Unit 8, the temporal lobe, one on each side of the brain, one on the left hemisphere and one on the right hemisphere, is the region of your cerebral cortex responsible for auditory processing. Well, to get information from the ears all the way to the brain, it needs to follow this four-step process. Sound waves enter your ear canal, first hit off the eardrum, but then eventually cause stimulation in the middle ear, these three regions here. Vibrations produced from the middle ear onto the cochlea here in the inner ear, this purple almost looks like a snail, eventually produces action potentials that are sent to the temporal lobe. The depth and the extent to which we need to talk about the anatomy and some of the finer details of hearing is not nearly to the level of vision, but nevertheless, we'll still run through some of the anatomy and then some of the subsequent characteristics of hearing. First is to talk about the middle ear. It's unlikely that you would need to know these three structures by name, but I think it is useful to know the process or the purpose of the middle ear and how it fits into this overall process. The middle ear is a reference to three tiny little bones that you see here in these different shades of blue, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, sometimes called the occipital chain. The key detail here is that the middle ear follows the eardrum, which is indicated here with this dark green. When sound waves enter your ear canal and hit off the eardrum, they produce stimulation here in the middle ear. The vibrations that are caused by that chain of events eventually produces stimulations onto a region called the inner ear, which you actually can see pictured here. The inner ear consists primarily for our purposes of what's called the cochlea, which looks like this little snail. The other region is called the inner ear. The inner ear is a reference to two regions. One, the auditory nerve, and two, more importantly, what the College Board typically cites, the cochlea. If you notice here, looking at the diagram, the cochlea looks like a purple snail. I've made that comment several times. Well, the cochlea is lined with hair receptors, and the vibrations caused by the middle ear, here located in the dark blue, produce stimulations on the receptors on the cochlea. Those stimulations produce action potentials that are sent via the auditory nerve to the brain for ultimate processing. So in many ways, when we look at a diagram of the ear, it's really quite simple how this works in this really simplified way that we're looking at it. Sound waves enter the ear canal, which is right here. They hit the eardrum. That causes these three little bones in the middle ear to begin. Those movements produce vibrations onto the cochlea, which is part of the inner ear, the current box that we're talking about. Those vibrations stimulate the hair receptors on the basilar membrane, or on the membrane of the cochlea. Those stimulations produce action potentials that are then sent to the brain via the auditory nerve, sending the brain details of what it is that you are hearing at any given moment. Zoom back out. That's it for the anatomy. We're just going to call it middle ear and inner ear, and really the only anatomical structure that I could ask you about in any depth is the cochlea, a part of the inner ear. I won't ask you about the tiny little bones in the middle ear. That's trivial in the context of what we're talking about. We just need some big picture understandings about hearing. We are, though, going to talk about a few characteristics of hearing. The first is what's called sound localization. So the fact that we have two ears leads us to a skill called sound localization. If a sound is produced off to your right, so this is my right over here, the sound waves produced by my snapping technically hit my right ear before they hit my left ear. The literal distance between the source of the sound, right here, my snapping, and my right ear is smaller than the distance between my fingers and my left ear. As a result, my brain can interpret the difference between which ear received that information first and use that as a means of identifying the sound localization, or the location of the sound. So for example, if you hear a sound way off to the left, the sound waves produced by the voice, the door opening, the song playing, whatever it happens to be, it technically is going to reach your left ear before it hits your right ear. And that difference between what ear is stimulated first can be used to judge distance. It can get a little bit more complicated if objects are directly in front of you or directly above you. Obviously, at that point, the sound is going to reach both ears at the same time. But your brain can also use that to judge the fact that the item must be completely in front of you. And quite frankly, honestly, there is always going to be a slight shift towards the left and right in judging distance in terms of determining the location of a sound. But sound localization is the brain's process of determining the location of a sound by judging which ear was stimulated by sound waves first. If this was an FRQ, it is important to really emphasize that the two-ear element of this works because we have two ears. If only had one ear, it certainly wouldn't work like that. It's because we have two ears, and our brain can judge the difference between which ear was stimulated first. The next two theories fall under the category name of pitch. When I use the word pitch, I'm basically talking about why when you play a piano, each of the keys produces a different sound. So when I allude to the term pitch, that's what I'm referencing. Why do we hear different sounds when somebody plays all of the keys of a piano sort of in an ascending or descending fashion? There are two conflicting theories that explain why we hear different pitches. The first is what's called place theory. Place theory essentially argues that our cochlea works almost like a keyboard itself, where there are different parts of the cochlea associated with different pitches, and that depending on the unique location of the stimulation, it's going to produce its own unique different pitch, so that when that information is then sent to the brain, we hear one thing versus the other because a certain portion or place on the cochlea was stimulated. And you really can emphasize that word place in reference to location. It's all about what place along the cochlea's membrane, which its technical name is the basilar membrane. That was an FRQ bullet one year, and it was probably the most difficult FRQ bullet of all time. Very few AP teachers use that term in their materials. I added that term as a result. Technical, the name of the cochlea is membrane. It's not just membrane. It's called the basilar membrane. Highly doubt they would ever include that again. It was sort of a really challenging FRQ bullet that very few students approached properly. Nevertheless, we look at the basilar membrane, the outside layer of the cochlea. We assume that each region of the cochlea is associated with a different pitch, and we use that to hear all the different sounds, for example, on a piano. The other theory is what we call frequency theory, and it's the idea that different pitches produce different levels of stimulation, and some pitches result in more action potentials being sent to the brain, while other pitches obviously would do the inverse. So the question of what do we hear, the different pitches that we hear, is a byproduct of how frequently the cochlea, again, the inner region of the ear that looks like a snail, is sending messages to the brain. Some sounds that have high pitches have higher frequencies. Some sounds that have low pitches have lower frequencies. And that the quantity of messages sent to the brain, not the location of the cochlea that's stimulated, just simply how frequently this cochlea has been stimulated, determines the different pitches, which again is a reference to the different sounds that one could hear on a piano. The last little bit is to just very briefly talk about, very generally, the two different types of hearing loss. There are a variety of reasons why one could lose their hearing. There could be damage to your temporal lobes, but if we're going to talk about just the anatomical structures of the ear from today, there are really two separate reasons why one could lose their hearing. One is conduction hearing loss, which means there's damage to the middle ear, which are the three bone structures that we talked about, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. So the regions right here. And also a little bit of a different diagram from what we had, but I'm referencing the three little bone structures. The other is damage to the inner ear, more particularly the cochlea. Damage to the cochlea would produce sensorineural neural hearing loss. A little bit of a mnemonic to differentiate these two. The cochlea is the inner ear region and is responsible for beginning the neural process of hearing, for taking information that you've just heard and using the auditory nerve to send action potentials, which is a synonym for a neuron firing, to the brain for ultimate processing. Damage to the cochlea is going to produce sensorineural neural hearing loss, and you can use that word neural to connect it with the cochlea and use that to differentiate these two regions of the ear in connection to what might produce hearing loss.